I'm looking at two sets of data that contain the same information, they're just formatted differently. The information is sales numbers for different employees across the months of January, February, and March. The view on the left presents this data in what's referred to as long format, and the view on the right shows it in wide format. For long format, there is more of an emphasis on the rows. So you can see for the different employees, there's repeat rows for each employee to capture the sales data for the 3 different months we're looking at. Now, the wide format has more of an emphasis on the columns. So we're going to see a single row for each employee, but we're going to see unique columns for each of the months, and that's where we're going to capture the sales data. To remember the difference between the two, with wide format, because you're going to have more columns, your data looks wider. Whereas with long format, because you're going to have more rows, it ends up looking longer or taller. In terms of choosing the appropriate format for your data, there's pros and cons to both. Wide format tends to be more human-friendly. It's easier for us to quickly glance at this data and make comparisons. But long format's going to be more appropriate for a lot of the analyses you're going to be doing in R when working with your data. Different functions for grouping, summarizing, or visualizing the data is just going to work better with long format, and sometimes it's actually necessary. So at the end of the day, there's a use case for both formats. So let's get into how we can convert our data from one to the other. If you want to follow along with the code, you can go to the notes that accompany this video and scroll down to example data. I have the data sets that we were just looking at. Let's start out with the long format version. So I'm just going to bring this into our studio. I've got a file set up. And what I did is I just created a comma separated value set of data. Again, it's just our employee month and sales information. And we're going to read that in as a data frame. So let me go ahead and just run that. And then let's just view our data. So there is that long format. And like I said, we want to convert this to wide format. In order to do this, we're going to use the tidyr package. So at the top of my file, we'll say library tidyr. And then down at the bottom of the file, I'll create a new object that's going to store my reshaped data. So I'm just going to call this data wide. And then within the tidyr package, I'm going to be using a function called pivot wider. Now tidyr does use piping syntax. So before I invoke this function, I need to indicate which data I want to pass to it. So in this example, that's just going to be my existing data object. And we'll follow that up with our piping syntax. All right, so data is going to get passed to the pivot wider function. And the first thing we need to tell this function is from our existing long format data, which column do we want to take the values from and convert them to new columns in our wide format? And in this case, that's going to be the month column because we want things like January, February, March to be new columns in our wide format data. So the way we're going to indicate that is with an argument called names from, and I'll set that to be month. Then the second bit of information I need to pass this function is where it's going to get the values for each of those columns. And that's going to come from the sales column. So the argument we want to use here is values from, and we're going to set that to sales. So let's go ahead and run that. And you can see we've got a new data wide object. So I'm going to click that to view it. And perfect, there is our data transform. So we've got one row for each employee. And then here are our new columns, January, February, March. And they each have the appropriate values for each of the employees. So that's the process of going from long to wide. Now let's do the reverse. Let's go from wide to long. And again, going back to the notes that accompany this video, I've got some starting data we can work with. So let me go back to my script and we're going to leave the tidyr library there, but I'm going to paste in a new data object. Let me clear my existing objects, load this new data object. Let's take a look at it. All right, so here's wide format, which is basically what we ended up in the previous step, but we're just starting fresh. We're going to write the code that's going to convert this back to long format. So let's say data long, that'll be our new object. We're going to pass it our data and use our piping syntax. And this time, instead of pivot wider, we're going to be looking at pivot longer. And the first thing we're going to indicate is which calls we want to be translated to long format. So in the case of this, that's going to be columns January, February, and March. So I'm going to indicate that as a vector. I'll create that vector using R's C function or combine function. So we'll say January, February, March. And then following the columns, I'm going to use the argument names to. And I need to come up with a column header for where January and February, March rows are going to be stored. So logically, that should be called month. And then values to, What is the column header for the sales values? Well, logically, we should call that sales. So let's go ahead and run this and then take a look at our resulting data long object. And perfect, we're back in long format. Now, just a quick syntax shortcut. Rather than listing out each of the columns we wanted to convert, we could just list the columns we want to exclude. All right, so if we look at our original wide format data, basically that's just the employee column. All the other columns we wanted to be converted to their own rows. So the syntax would look like this. Instead of this vector, we could exclude the employee column. We're going to do that using this negation operator or the negative sign. So now if we run that, take a look at our data long again, we're going to get the exact same results, just a little bit terser syntax. And you can imagine how this would be useful if you had many columns. Let's say you had all 12 months or even more than that. You might have 20 different columns you want to be converting. Rather than having to list all of them, you could just exclude the columns that you don't want to be converting.